not with family gathered around me, not with the comfort of familiar voices, but entirely alone in a country I had never been to before. David Moore was 35. He was my pride and joy, my only child, and the person who called me every Sunday without fail. He had a way of making me feel seen, even on days when the rest of the world seemed to pass me by. When he got a 6-month contract with a tech company in Singapore, he called it an adventure. I called it an opportunity of a lifetime. We both thought it would be a chapter in his career that would lead to something even greater. Neither of us imagined it would be the last chapter of his life. I had worked hard to build a modest, peaceful life in Portland after my husband passed away 10 years ago. Gardening kept me busy. Baking for the church group kept me connected. But David was the heartbeat of my days. Even from across the ocean, we spoke often. He told me about the food stalls he loved, the people at his office, the small apartment with the balcony where he grew potted herbs, because it reminded him of home. Then came the call that changed everything. One moment we were laughing about my stubborn tomato plants. 8 hours later I was booking the first available flight halfway across the world, desperate to reach his hospital bed. By the time I arrived he was unconscious. 5 days later he was gone. Arranging his funeral in Singapore was a blur of paperwork, unfamiliar customs, and quiet tears. My family back in the United States offered words over the phone, but no one came. Flights were too expensive, they said. Work was too demanding, so I stood by his grave without them. When I finally returned to Portland after more than 30 hours of travel, I thought the worst was over. I had no idea the hardest part was still ahead, and that what happened next would nearly cost me my life. David had always been ambitious, but never at the expense of kindness. When he called me to tell me about the contract in Singapore, his voice was buzzing with excitement. "It's only 6 months, Mom," he said. "You should come visit halfway through. We'll eat at the hawker stalls and see the gardens by the bay." I told him I would, and I meant it. The first 2 months went smoothly. We video called nearly every day. He showed me the city lights from his balcony, the tiny kitchen where he cooked noodle soups, and the street musicians he passed on his way to work. I booked my ticket for a 3-week visit over the holidays, and we spent those days like tourists and locals at once, riding the MRT, sipping kopi at small cafes, and walking along the Marina Bay waterfront at night. We laughed about how small his apartment was, but he said it was perfect for now. One day, he told me, "I'll get a place big enough for you to stay as long as you want." 3 months later, everything changed. One morning during our usual video call, David pressed his hand to his forehead and said he had a splitting headache. "Probably just stress," he shrugged. "Big project deadline coming up." I told him to rest, drink water, and take something for it. 8 hours later my phone rang. It was one of his coworkers speaking in a shaky voice. David had collapsed in a meeting and was rushed to the hospital. I booked the first flight I could find 26 hours, with 2 layovers. By the time I reached the hospital in Singapore, he was in a coma. A doctor explained that he'd suffered a brain aneurysm, and though they performed emergency surgery, the damage was catastrophic. For 5 days I sat beside his bed, holding his hand, talking to him, and hoping for a miracle. I played his favorite songs softly from my phone, told him stories from when he was little, and reminded him of all the plans we still had, but his eyes never opened. When he passed, I was told that repatriating his body to the United States would cost far more than I could afford. I didn't have the strength to fundraise or navigate that process from halfway around the world. I made the decision to lay him to rest in Singapore. The funeral was small, just a few of his co-workers, a couple of expatriates he'd befriended, and me. The cemetery was quiet, shaded by tall trees that let light fall in gentle patches on the ground. I sent photos of the service to my family back home. They said it was nice, and asked if I'd considered cremation to make things easier. No one offered to come. No one asked if I was managing the paperwork alone. They said they were praying for me, and then went back to their schedules. Arranging the funeral in a foreign country was exhausting. The paperwork for his death certificate took 3 days, each requiring trips to different government offices. I relied on translation apps, kind strangers, and the patience of hospital staff. Every night, I returned to the small apartment David had rented, surrounded by his clothes and the faint scent of his cologne. On my last morning there, I visited his grave one more time. I placed fresh flowers on the headstone and sat on the damp grass, telling him what I'd be bringing home, his favorite leather jacket, the watch I gave him for his 30th birthday, and the seashells we collected during our holiday trip to the islands. I promised I'd carry him with me every day for the rest of my life. I boarded my flight to Portland believing the hardest part was behind me. I didn't yet know that my return home would unravel into something far more dangerous. After more than 30 hours of travel, with my body running on stale airplane coffee and grief, I landed in Portland just after 5 in the evening. My legs ached, my head throbbed, and all I wanted was a familiar face to greet me. While waiting in the customs line, I sent a message to the family group chat. Just landed. Can someone pick me up? The first reply came from my daughter, Lisa. Busy, get an Uber. A minute later, my younger brother, Mark, added, should've planned better, Helen. I stared at the phone screen for a long moment, my hands trembling. In the midst of all I had been through, I had hoped foolishly, perhaps for a moment of care from them. Instead, I forced my fingers to type back, no worries, though there was nothing worry-free about the way my chest ached. I dragged my 3 suitcases, one with my clothes, 2 with David's belongings off the carousel and hauled them toward the rideshare pickup area. The driver, an older man named Paul, helped load my bags without complaint. He tried to make polite conversation, but my mind drifted in and out, caught between exhaustion and the heaviness of carrying David's life in those bags. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the sky had turned a dull steel gray. The house looked exactly as I had left it months before, but something felt off. When I stepped inside, the air was icy, almost painful to breathe. The thermostat on the wall was dark, no heat. I could see my breath in the dim light. I walked into the kitchen and froze. The floor glistened with water. A steady drip echoed from above, and when I looked up, I saw a dark, wet crack in the ceiling. The smell of damp plaster and cold air hit me hard. My heart sank as I realized a pipe must have burst in the cold snap while I was gone. I called Mark. The house is flooded, and there's no heat, I told him. His voice was impatient, as if I had interrupted something important. That's rough, he said. Try another plumber. I can't help right now, we've got guests coming over. I called Lisa. She answered on the 3rd ring. Mom, we're in the middle of setting up for the bridge club tomorrow. It's just bad timing. I stood there, listening to their excuses while cold water crept through the soles of my shoes. My fingers were stiff, my shoulders heavy with travel and grief. I hung up, realizing I was on my own again. It was late, I was exhausted, and the temperature inside the house continued to drop. I told myself I'd deal with the leak in the morning, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of another ordeal, one I hadn't planned for, and one I would have to face without the family I had once counted on. The sound of dripping water echoed in the empty house, each drop a reminder that I could not ignore the damage. I swapped my soaked shoes for an old pair of boots and went to the utility closet where the main water shutoff valve was. The metal wheel was stiff and icy under my hands, biting into my fingers as I tried to turn it. After several grunts and twists, the flow of water finally stopped, but the damage was already spreading through the house. I should have stopped there, but the bitter cold inside made me think about the heating system. Maybe if I could get it working, I could warm up at least one room for the night. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the basement stairs, which were slick with water. The basement was dim and smelled of damp concrete. Water was already pooling around my ankles. The electrical panel was across the room. I waded over, my boots sloshing with each step. As I reached for the panel door, my foot slipped on the slick floor. Instinctively, I caught myself by grabbing the metal box. A sharp, searing jolt shot up my arm. My vision went white, and my body seized before the force threw me backward into the water. The back of my head smacked against something hard. For a few seconds, I could not tell where I was. The ceiling spun, and the cold seeped into my bones. My right arm tingled painfully from the shock, and when I touched my temple, my fingers came away sticky and red. Blood trickled down my face. I knew I needed to get out of the basement, but my body felt heavy, uncooperative. Each step toward the stairs was an effort. Halfway up, my vision blurred, and I had to grip the railing to keep from collapsing. By the time I reached the living room, I could barely breathe. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, and my fingers felt numb. I collapsed onto the sofa, too weak to even pull a blanket over myself. A faint beeping sound broke through the haze. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I realized the carbon monoxide detector. My stomach dropped. The heating system must have been damaged, releasing gas into the house. My phone lay just out of reach on the coffee table, but my body refused to move. I remember thinking, almost calmly, that maybe this was it. That after losing David, maybe I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. My eyes closed and I drifted somewhere between waking and sleep. The pounding at the door was distant at first, then sharper. A woman's voice called my name, Diane, my neighbor from across the street. She must have seen the water seeping from my front door. The next thing I remember is the sound of wood splintering as the fire department forced the door open. Strong arms lifted me, and someone said, "She's hypothermic and exposed to company, we need oxygen now." I felt the cold air outside, then the sharp, sterile smell of the ambulance. Later I learned that Diane had tried calling me but got no answer. She came over, heard the carbon monoxide alarm, and immediately dialed 911. The firefighters arrived just in time. A few more hours, the paramedics told me, and I might not have survived. I should have been relieved, and I was, but there was a gnawing sadness too. I thought about how it wasn't my family who found me, who found me. It was a neighbor who barely knew me, yet cared enough to act without hesitation. At the hospital, I drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked. They wrapped me in heated blankets, placed an oxygen mask over my face, and cleaned the gash on my temple. A nurse named Sarah explained that I had hypothermia, a mild concussion, and carbon monoxide poisoning. She said I was lucky my neighbor had acted quickly. I barely remember telling Sarah about losing David, about the funeral overseas, about the cold and flooded house. She listened without interrupting, and when she stepped out of the room, I thought that was the end of it. But fate had other plans. A local reporter named Michael Chen was at the hospital covering storm-related emergencies. He overheard a paramedic talking about my case, a widow who had just buried her only son abroad, returned home to a disaster, and nearly died because no one checked on her. It was, as he later told me, the kind of human story that makes people stop scrolling and pay attention. Michael found Diane and interviewed her. On camera, she described how she saw water spilling from my doorway and knew something was wrong. She mentioned she had noticed me arrive home alone in a rideshare the day before, struggling with heavy suitcases. The next part surprised me. One of the paramedics had seen the family group chat open on my phone when they found me. He shared the exchange, my message asking for a ride and the replies telling me to get an Uber and plan better. Michael didn't name my relatives, but the implication was clear. That night, the story aired, local woman returns from son's overseas funeral, nearly dies alone in storm-damaged home. The segment showed footage of emergency crews at my door, the flooded kitchen, and the carbon monoxide alarm blaring. My voice wasn't in it, but my situation spoke for itself. Within hours, the story spread online. In neighborhood groups, people posted screenshots of the text exchange. The comments poured in, some angry, some sympathetic, all incredulous that a family could respond that way. The hashtag No Worries began trending locally. By the next morning, businesses had reached out. A plumbing company offered to repair my pipes for free. A restoration service promised to handle the water damage. A hotel chain arranged for me to stay in a warm suite until the repairs were complete. Strangers I had never met were showing more concern for my safety than my own family. The morning after the news segment aired, I woke to find my hospital room crowded. My brother Mark stood by the door, his face pale. "We just saw the news," he began. "They're making it sound like we abandoned you." My daughter Lisa followed, speaking before I could answer. "It's a complete misrepresentation. If we'd known the house was in that condition, we would have helped." Neither of them asked how I was feeling. Neither mentioned David. My father was there too, quiet and watchful. It wasn't until the nurse stepped out that he asked the only question that felt genuine. "Are you going to be okay?" A hospital social worker named Ems Padel arrived soon after to discuss discharge plans. She listed the community support already arranged, a 2-week stay at the Riverview Hotel, prepared meals delivered daily, transportation to appointments, and volunteers to check in on me. "You do not have to stay with family if that's not what you want," she said clearly. Before I could speak, Lisa jumped in. "She'll come home with us." "Of course she will. We're family." I looked from her to Mark. "What exactly have you done?" I asked quietly. "That makes you believe you should decide how I recover?" Mark frowned. "That's unfair, we didn't know." "You didn't ask," I interrupted. "Not when David was dying, not when I buried him alone, not when I asked for a ride from the airport, not when my house flooded, not once did you ask how I was really doing." Lisa's cheeks flushed. "Families can't drop everything for every crisis." Needing heat in my house during winter is not in every crisis, I replied. My father shifted uncomfortably. Grief makes people say things they don't mean. I'm thinking more clearly now than I have in years, I told him. I've spent my life taking scraps of attention and calling it love. That ends today. Ms. Patel waited, then asked again, Helen, where would you like to go after discharge? I took a deep breath. I'll take the community arrangement. The room fell silent. Choosing strangers over family was unthinkable to them, but to me, it felt like the first step towards saving myself. 2 days later, I left the hospital and moved into the Riverview Hotel. The room overlooked the river, and the warmth hit me the moment I stepped inside. The refrigerator was stocked with soups, fresh bread, and fruit. A vase of flowers sat on the table with a card signed by the hospital staff, who had cared for me. Every day, neighbors and volunteers stopped by. Diane brought homemade chicken stew. A retired teacher named Margaret came to sit with me on the harder days, saying little but offering quiet company. The grief support group EMS. Padel connected me to Met twice a week in a cozy community center. At first, I barely spoke. Then, little by little, I found my voice. With the insurance payout from David's employer, I started the David Moore Memorial Scholarship for International Education. It would help students study abroad with emergency funds for unexpected crises, the kind of safety net I wish we'd had. Working on the scholarship gave me purpose. Each decision was a way of honoring my son and ensuring his legacy would help others. It didn't erase the grief, but it gave the pain somewhere to go, somewhere to be transformed into something meaningful. Weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from my father, the first I could remember. In it, he admitted he had failed me, not only when I came home from Singapore, but in the deeper duty to be there during my darkest hours. He asked if we could try to build something new, on different terms. I agreed, but with boundaries. We would meet occasionally, just the two of us. No forced gatherings, no pretending for appearances. Lisa and Mark kept their distance, sending holiday cards but never addressing what happened. I accepted it,